Welcome to Corporate Law Lab. I'm your host, Neil Taylor. Today we're joined by Joe Ankus. I've known Joe for quite some time, both in a professional capacity, and I would say that he was my next door neighbor, but it'd be more proper to say he was the next door neighbor to my family when I spent a year during my Millicom days traveling the world almost constantly. But it was good because my family knew where to go if the hurricane came through, which luckily it didn't. So welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Thanks, Neil.
So you have been in the legal recruiting industry for, 35 years now?
I started in roughly October of 1991, long before the internet and long before email.
Great. And before that, so you are a lawyer by training. I assume, have you kept your bar license all this time?
I still keep my Florida bar license. When I graduated law school, I practiced first in Philly at Deckert as a corporate securities lawyer and creditors' rights lawyer. And then I transitioned down to Miami. I'm from Miami Beach, and I joined the Miami office of Holland & Knight.
You went to Penn undergrad, right?
I did.
What'd you major in?
So I had a communications degree from Annenberg and a minor from Wharton in marketing.
And was going to law school always the plan, or was that something that came up as a what do I do next thing?
I think option B was the accurate truth. I distinctly remember when I was at the end of my senior year, or maybe perhaps a little bit earlier than that, because I had to apply to law school. I remember my parents basically saying, well, you're at a crossroads. You can graduate college and get a job and be on your own, or we'll pay for you to go to law school. And that was really easy decision, despite the fact that I had, at that moment in time, little or no interest in going to law school. But the thought of actually not having any fiscal responsibility for 3 years was very appealing. And so I applied and attended law school.
Did you keep that part secret from your parents that you didn't really want to?
Probably. I probably, seeing as I come from a family of lawyers, I'm sure I said something like, the study of law actually does fascinate me. Something to that effect. And now multiple decades later, I can tell you the truth. Yeah, no, I had no interest in going.
So how did you find the transition from undergrad to law school?
Pretty seamless, actually, because, I had done quite a bit of writing, and quite a bit of speaking. So the transition was actually, I would say, seamless. Obviously, the concepts were a lot different. The course load was more rigorous. And kind of this, Neil, as a lawyer, kind of thinking like a lawyer required some degree of mental gymnastics and some tenacity. But overall, I think my grounding from undergrad made it easier than some of my classmates. For example, we had a few that had hard science backgrounds that simply really never had to do any writing at all.
Yeah, I always ask that question, and I've come to find that we generally get people that were like, yeah, it was fine. And I know that's not that way for everyone. But, for someone like you who graduated, got a job in what is now called, I don't remember anybody calling it big law back in the day.
No, they just, yeah.
But you must have done okay to be able to land there, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I did well in law school. I mean, I paid the price in terms of lack of going out and lack of, any sort of relevant socialization. But, I was able to parlay that into, two quote, great jobs, close quote. Because as, our conversation develops, you'll see how I kind of took a different turn by choice. But both firms, as far as firms go, they were great. I had no issues with the firms. But, things have changed. As you said, we didn't really talk in terms of the Am law. We didn't talk about big law. It was apples and oranges, as you know.
Right. In hindsight, do you wish you had taken any time? And I guess given that your parents made it fiscally irresponsible for you to take time between undergrad and law school, I just wonder. I took a few years in between, not really a plan, more of a rehabilitate my GPA and that before I take the LSAT. But for you, in hindsight, do you wish you'd done something different in between?
I absolutely. I think that I really almost would, advocate for a more uniform acceptance of the concept about saying, doing at least a year or two where you get a chance to do a lot of the things you would have liked to have done that as you progress forward become increasingly more difficult. For example, I certainly wasn't opposed to working. Would it have been wonderful to go abroad, travel Europe? I was, all of 23 or something like that. It would have been a wonderful time to do that. But there, even back then, there was kind of this, where are you going next? And are you on a track? I don't think my trajectory would have been any different if I'd have had a couple of years off, or a minimum of a year. I think I would have certainly, enjoyed that. And I wish more people, if they had the ability to do it, would do it versus feeling obligated, under some kind of, preordained construct that they need to go right to graduate school. I think it really bears comment very briefly that when I started my first job as a lawyer, I had no idea when I was working on transactions what the most basic things were about business. I didn't know this is embarrassing, but I didn't know what an invoice was. I didn't know, basic things, accounts receivable, balance sheets, all sorts of things about just running a business. I had no real life experience where I could actually bring something to the table and understand a client better. I knew how to research and write. I knew about, theoretics. But certainly if I'd have worked and actually seen a business in action, I think that would have enhanced, A, my practice, and B, probably brought a little more gloss to the law school experience.
Well, and you've also done a nice plug for us for the business essentials for lawyers who've graduated and are out there in firms without having had any of that background like you did. Yeah. So we're working with the business school to put something together.
It makes complete sense. It really is important. The more intimately you can understand your client's business and understand business in general, I believe the more effective and comprehensive lawyer you can be. And that's, as you said, that is unsolicited, but I genuinely believe that.
So knowing you as long as I have, I know that you didn't find private practice the thrill that all the rest of us found it to be. And I say that very tongue-in-cheek. But what attracted you to the firms that you joined?
Well, what attracted me to the firms that I joined, it was very clear. They were both very well regarded, and they both, they had that kind of once you graduate law school cachet, the kind of, they had the best cocktail parties kind of thing, and they paid the most amount of money. But what really attracted me to each one of them specifically was the culture. Both of them genuinely had a welcoming, kind group of professionals. I really can say that I enjoyed the people that I worked with. And I made that selection consciously. I had other opportunities, and really for me, all the, the quality of work would have been almost identical. The compensation would have almost been identical. So now you're really dealing with that intangible. And both Deckard and Holland really had a group of kind, welcoming professionals that I knew I would fit in most closely with. And I, in fact, did.
And then you decided at some point to leave the practice and to start doing what you are now, a legal recruiter. We'll call you a headhunter later, but for now we'll stick with legal recruiter. Tell me about that transition. I mean, one question is, how did you even discover that becoming a legal recruiter was a possibility?
This is probably, the most important question, or one of the most important questions I'll answer, and as so adequately asked by you. So the answer is this. My first inkling about wanting to ever do this came about, not surprisingly, when I was at Deckard, and I got a phone call one day, and somebody said to me, "Joe," and I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. Would you ever have an interest in hearing about another opportunity?" And I thought, first I thought, oh, that's kind of a cool job. So I talked to the person, couldn't remember their name to save my life, but what they basically said was, yeah, I've got these opportunities with other firms. What I do is I basically, if you're interested, I learn about what you've done, and then I see whether or not it would be an appropriate match for my client's needs. And I thought, oh, it's kind of like a real estate broker for people. And I like people. I've always liked people. So I thought it was kind of a cool thing. I, at that time, wasn't really interested in making a change. So I wasn't, what we would call a movable candidate at that point. I actually think I said something a little pithy. I think I said something like, well, if you have something at Wachtell, I said, maybe I'll consider it, which really was just, in retrospect, stupid. I mean, if I'm being honest, I'll never forget, but I did say it. I said, well, if you've got a corporate job at Wachtell, and I started laughing, like, even when I said it, because I'm like, that is ridiculous. But the point is was my first inkling about it, kind of like somebody actually calling me. But what really precipitated the change, the real precipitation of the change, was a confluence of a few things. So I have to back up very briefly. So when I left Deckard, I'm from Miami Beach, Florida. My parents were getting older. I knew that I wanted to be in Florida just to be a support. And so I rejoined Holland Knight. I had summer clerk there, and they wanted me to come back, but I went up to Philadelphia because that's where my then girlfriend, now wife of 32 years, was. And so when I came back to Holland, I had never met my boss, and I came into my office, and it was very early January of 1991, literally January, first month of January. And I come in, and my boss says to me, he comes in with a stack of about 14 files. And I'll never forget, they were that avocado green that you remember from the 70s with this really, really boring packing tape brown binder on them. And he has a big grin on his face, and he drops them on my desk, and I still hear the thud. And he says, "These are all yours." And he says, "You'll get to be a lawyer now." And most people would have thought, oh my God, I'm done writing research memos. I'm actually going to talk to clients. I can actually do what Perry Mason does on TV. And rather than being exhilarated, the anxiety and terror I felt was equivalent to being hit in the head with a bat. And I don't say it to be dramatic, but I'm telling you that's how I felt. And so at that moment in time, rather than embrace this opportunity, I literally was, in fact, paralyzed by fear. And I don't share this with any need for pity or sympathy. I say that to everybody. This is about explanation and education. And so for me, once I felt that my head was crushed, I struggled for about 9 months. And I always say just long enough to have a baby. And in the interim, in the throes of my anxiety, I get a phone call from a recruiter. And the recruiter calls me, and again, this is what happened. He said, "Hey, Joe," and I know his name because I ended up working with him for 5 years. He goes, "This is Herb." It's a great name for a recruiter, Herb. And I said, "Hi, Herb." And he says, "Do you want to go talk to X?" Insert another big law firm.
Right.
And I said, "No, Herb, I want to do what you do." And he said, "Really?" And I said, "Really." And he thought, this is great. I got a lawyer that wants to actually headhunt. And so that's how I got into legal recruiting. I knew big law was not for me. Herb's call came in at let's just say a vulnerable time for me. And it all dovetailed in. And that's how I ended up getting started. So I started at H&K in January of 91. I was, as we say in recruiting, smiling and dialing by October of 1991. And that gives you kind of the genesis of how I got into the business.
So thank you for telling the story, because I think it's important, and the fact that you're just open about it, I think, is great. Because, having gone through 3 years of law school, 4 years of undergrad, moving back, all the money, all of everything, you must have felt a real compulsion to just put your head down and stick with it. It's not like you've had that feeling on day one and left. But it must have been, even then, I don't know, was it hard at that point to make that call?
So the answer was, it wasn't hard to make the call, to the extent that I really got to a tipping point where I said, it's going to be my health or it's going to be this job. And again, I always caveat, this is not for sympathy, this is not for pity, but this is factual.
Right.
I would lay in bed and sweat. I couldn't get out of bed to go to work. I would think about work constantly. I knew I was in trouble when I'm in the shower shampooing my hair going, did I file that? Was that case overturned? And I said, it really reached a critical mass where I said, I am overly vigilant. I am too hyper-focused on this stuff. What I did was I was actually making my clients' problems my own problems. And the ironic part of the whole thing about this experience was that I was dealing with large banks who made some bad loans on, crappy collateral. I mean, nobody, as my father would say to me, he would say, "Joe, I don't know why you're so upset. Nobody is sick. Nobody is dying." He says, if you won't malpractice, but even if you did, your clients are protected. You're with one of the biggest firms. They have malpractice. And he kept saying, I know you're upset, but I just can't understand it. And I said, if I could explain it to you, I would. I can only tell you how I'm feeling. And you have to remember, in 1991, there was really nobody to talk to. There were no resources. There were no internets. There was nothing. So I found a psychiatrist out of desperation by looking in the yellow pages, which any of your younger listeners are going to go, what the hell are the yellow pages? But basically, imagine
it was
Google,
a 6-inch thick internet.
a 6-inch thick internet, which basically was a phone directory, alphabetized. So I looked under P for psychiatrist or D for doctor, and then the subcategory. But I mean, this is what you did. Nobody talked about it. And so I shuffled off to this guy. He was a nice guy, kind of an older guy, and, wanted to spend an inordinate amount of time talking about, my childhood. I'm like, dude, you don't get it. This is not about my childhood. This is about the fact that I'm concerned that I'm going to screw up and, make a mistake and lose my license and blah, 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 blah. I go, I need short-term help here. I don't need to worry that my mother didn't give me, dessert. That's not what's going on here. And, and the guy was like, and then he would always do like, well, that's interesting. I'm like, no, dude, it's not interesting. I said, I need help. Yeah. And so after, 2 productive sessions, I said, okay, I'm done. I survival mechanism, fight or flight, and I flew. And that's really, in a nutshell, what, got me on the phones as a headhunter.
It reminds me of, I saw a post, and we'll start talking about what headhunters do and who you are and what you're not in just a second. But it just reminded me of a post I saw recently on LinkedIn where a young lawyer was posting about their anxiety reduction strategies on Sunday night when they realized they'd have to go back to work, and all the different things they did to be able to cope, to be able to go back to work on Monday morning. And, and it was like, well, it's very impressive as, a set of behaviors to undertake to be able to get yourself to go to work on Monday morning. But it's also like, I was like, well, there's a blinking red light that you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, I really think that there is something to be said for the fact that, look, in theory, law is a wonderful profession. And in reality, it's a wonderful profession for a lot of people. I practiced with lawyers who were phenomenal, but most importantly, they loved what they did. And I was so happy for them because they loved it. They brought to the table this almost joyful exhilaration, whereas somebody like me, I just wasn't in my DNA. It wasn't intellectual. It was just emotional. And so there's, people tend to attach so much labeling to what, we don't say who we are as people. We just say who we are by profession. And I think that, that for those of us, that if law is not ideal, then it's okay. It's fine. Believe me, I know people that are in my business that, routinely earn $750,000 to $1 million a year. There's not a lot of them, but there's enough of them for me to tell you it's not a coincidence. And they love what they do. So it's really tapping into what you love, what you do. But if I tell this to everybody that will listen, if you don't have your health, you have nothing. You have nothing. You have nothing. So for those lawyers that love it, that relish it, that live it, more power to them. God bless them for what they have. But if you don't, and your health is suffering, and you're struggling in it because you think you have to prove it to anybody else, I would strongly recommend you to rethink your path and realize that you've got to take care of yourself first, and not worry about what anybody in your firm or family or friends will think, because having you be in dire straits doesn't really solve anything or help anything for anybody.
So let me skip ahead then, because I think it'd just be weird for us to leave this conversation and come back to it later in the outline as I'd planned to. So let me just go there. You are very active in mental health awareness with the Florida Bar, and I was going to ask why you got involved. I think I understand better now why you got involved. So let me just kind of get into the substance of it. We're all primed repeatedly with the need to work hard. I've had a number of different guests on this podcast where we ask, what can you do to be a success? And hard work certainly comes up more often than not. And it's a prerequisite. If you really want to be a successful lawyer, I don't know many that were just like, well, I worked a little bit and it all came to me. All the successful ones I know were hard workers. How can they do that and avoid burnout?
So I think that the short answer to that, and I don't profess to be an expert on burnout, I think the answer to that is just understanding and knowing yourself, which is at what point is every extra hour you're spending working bringing diminishing returns to you. It's not about keeping up with everybody else. Unfortunately, the system, though, until it changes from billable hours, those are used as a yardstick for productivity. And so therefore, you have people feeling less than or not having the horsepower or keeping up. And the way to avoid burnout, in my opinion, is basically, it's harder to do this as an associate. I know it is versus a partner, although partners have their own sets of stressors. But basically just saying out loud to yourself, this is what I'm willing to do and this is what I'm not willing to do. And understanding that, money, if you're miserable and you're rich, not so sure it really enhances the overall quality of your life. We've all known people that are phenomenally wealthy, miserable. And we sometimes scratch the back of our heads and say, why? But burnout for me, would be just really setting, some strong boundaries, which up through and including considering a different profession. And I know it. I know the inherent challenges with this. There's no easy answer. There's no, one size fits all. Sometimes desperation leads you to make the best choices because you just can't go on anymore. But if you aren't desperate, but you're starting to feel it, the only thing that would seem to me to make sense would be to figure out a way where you can kind of balance this out so that you're not feeling that you're really unable to move forward in any productive way. It's not good for your clients. It's not good for you. It's not good for your firm. It's not good for your family. And I've seen too many people.
You mentioned the billable hour, and I think one of the things I found myself doing when I was a young associate and had to stop was measuring the rest of my life in 6-minute increments. It's, there's I spent a 0.4 with the kids today. What else do you want from me? I've got this many hours to bill.
Yeah. Again, if I had a solution, I'm a big believer, and I know you are too. I am a big believer in, if you bring a problem to somebody, have a couple solutions at the same time, at least propose solutions. And when it comes to eradicating the billable hour, I know better minds than me have tried to tackle this problem, and you're really left with, very few options. Flat fee billing, which a lot of law firms, have a tough time doing because they are afraid they're going to get caught on the bad end of flat fee billing. Or, obviously if you're on a contingency, that's a whole different story. There really is no billables when you're on a contingency. But, there are certain professions where our stock in trade is measured. The variable is time. It's the time we're spending on behalf of somebody versus, how could we quantify in the legal profession, the results? It would be very difficult. You couldn't run an effective business. How could you forecast your cash flow? How could you manage payroll if you were like, well, we'll take this litigation on. It's not so much about contingency since we're defending you, but we're going to base our final fee on what we think we saved you by beating their claim. I mean, you couldn't run a business that way. Right. Effectively and have a staff. So
I don't think the billable hour is going away anytime soon because, like you said, the firm doesn't want to get caught out. The clients have just as much fear. I can tell you from that side. If I made a flat fee deal with my law firm and they didn't complain 6 months later, I knew I had lost, something in that negotiation.
Right, of course.
If I had happy lawyers, that was better. The worst is, when I made what I thought was a good deal and my law firm is desperately unhappy with the deal they've structured because they're keeping score the old way and they know that I've, managed to put more work on their backs than keeping score the old way would have paid for.
Right. Well, that's, it's It's frustrating. And you and I both know somewhere, if we did the research, there's probably, all sorts of scholarly articles coming up with different ideas, different ways. And I'm going to leave it to those people to figure that out. But coming back very focused to your question about burnout, the first thing is recognizing when you're starting to get burnout. And people that are really feeling malaise or wondering, they really should Google what burnout is, because there actually is a clinical definition of it, right? Having a bad day, having a bad week doesn't mean you're burned out. That's like, when I teach the mental health first aid and I talk about mental health, being sad for a day or two doesn't mean you're depressed. There are clinical definitions to these things. Being a little nervous doesn't mean you're necessarily anxious. So when somebody says I'm burned out, the question is, are you really burned out in a clinical sense, or are you just having a bad day, bad week, whatever it is, and being more self-aware about where you really are.
So what kind of resources are there for people that they don't know, is this burnout, is this depression, is this, there's performance anxiety that we all feel, or some of us used to feel before we get up in front of a crowd. Now, for me, 35 years on, getting in front of a crowd just feels like, okay, whatever. There's people out there, I'll talk to them.
Exactly. Yeah.
But, it wasn't that way 35 years ago when I started this, right?
Of course. And public speaking, not ironically, but public speaking is one of the greatest fears that people have. And the funny part about that is the reason why it's one of the greatest fears is because they're afraid of being embarrassed. And they're afraid of being embarrassed. That's really what it comes down to. Sounding stupid, sounding like a fool, and being embarrassed. So relating to resources, and one of the things that is so important, and I'm delighted to share them, because one of the goals that we had talked about this podcast before we did it was, giving people, listeners, something they can take away with and use. I'm a big advocate for credible resources you can use today for you, for a friend, a family member, a colleague, anybody that may be struggling, wants information. So let me share a few resources that I think are most relevant and helpful, not only for our population, meaning the legal population, but for anybody, okay? The first one is 988, literally the number 988. And that's the number for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And I always encourage anybody, including listeners, stop and put it in your phone. Hit pause and put it in your phone. 988. That number can be used if you yourself are feeling overwhelmed, suicidal, potentially suicidal, and want to talk to somebody. You can call 988. If somebody close to you, or not even close to you, is expressing suicidal thoughts, you can call that number with them next to you. You can conference call that number with them. You can call on your own and talk about what you're concerned about. But 988 is designed for all of us. And it is considered one of the primary resources that we can use in crisis situations. And that's why I talk about it first. I'm dividing the world between crisis and non-crisis situations. Another number, which everybody is familiar with, is 911. And what I'm going to share about 911 is this. If you feel it is necessary to call 911 for a mental health emergency, I'd like you to remember a few pointers. The first one is, when you call 911, tell the dispatcher this is a mental health crisis. It's number one. Number two, ask if they have a mobile crisis response team or if they have a crisis intervention officer. In many police departments, there are specially trained officers whose participation in showing up versus a non-trained officer can be critical in a more successful outcome. So we say, tell them it's a mental health emergency, ask for a crisis intervention officer or a mobile crisis response team. The other thing we want to tell the dispatcher is, are they in possession of a weapon? We also want to tell them if we believe they're under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And finally, we want to tell them whether or not this is a successor attempt, meaning they've had prior suicide attempts if we know. It's okay if you don't know most of this, so long as you get the first two out. Mental health crisis, and do you have a crisis intervention officer or mobile health crisis response team? So I want people to understand that when you call 911. If we shift to general information, non-crisis, I do volunteer work with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and that's NAMI, N-A-M-I, Nancy Apple Mary Indigo, NAMI.org. A wonderful first stop for credible mental health resources across the spectrum of mental health challenges. Okay? Not only does NAMI have a robust nationwide presence, but they're often found in every major city with local branches. I do work with the Palm Beach County branch down here in South Florida, but they're all across the country, and it's a wonderful first stop. And when I train or talk to people and I say, how many people you know have heard of NAMI? I get a smattering of hands. So NAMI is a phenomenal resource. You can also check with the American Bar Association website. Very, very important. They have information. You can also check with your state bar. Most state bars have incredible amounts of resources, credible resources. And so between NAMI, ABA, your state bar, for non-emergent type situations, very, very helpful information that is readily accessible to you as a starting point.
That's great. Thank you for all of that. Do you think as a profession we're getting better at recognizing and dealing with mental health?
I think it really becomes a question of perspective, right? So if you ask me, are we getting better? The answer is unequivocally, absolutely. But gauged against when and what, okay?
Is better good yet?
Right, well, in fact, that was genius, right? Is better good yet? And I'm going to say to you that relative to 1991, we're running, an excellent, right? We've evolved tremendously, multiple iterations like a Pokemon, right? We've evolved. But, do we have more to go? Absolutely. However, we collectively are doing our part to normalize this conversation. And yes, it is much more mainstream. Are there still significant pockets of resistance for a variety of reasons about mental health discussions and education? Yes, there is. But I'm an optimist, and I'm telling you things are absolutely much better. But that doesn't mean we should, pat ourselves on the back and rest on our laurels, because the reality is during the duration of this podcast, somebody out there is struggling. Somebody is struggling. I mean, and that's one of the things that I tell people when I do my trainings, when I talk to people, I say, the one thing I can promise you, I said, and lawyers promise nothing, right? You know that. We promise nothing. And my favorite example is the Lysol can. It kills 99.999% of all germs because a lawyer wrote it. They couldn't commit to 100%. Well, I can tell you with 100% accuracy that somebody that confides in you or is struggling, they are not alone. Period. End of story. Full stop. Whether it be anxiety, depression, bipolarity, eating disorder, substance use, doesn't matter. I promise you they're not alone. And people find that reassuring to understand at least that they're not weird or strange or weak or broken or damaged or crazy. I can give you all the euphemisms, but the bottom line is that, they're not alone. And that's one of the things that we can do to reassure somebody as we try to, at least guide them to resources and or professional help.
Do you think there are still people out there leading firms, law departments, whatever, who understand that they're supposed to say they care about this, but are just still giving it lip service?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know firsthand. I mean, I am, I am like the fly at the picnic, man. I mean, I just keep buzzing around a lot of people's heads, and and occasionally, nobody's ever actually, swatted me, but I get a lot of the, oh yeah, and again, there are reasons, okay, ranging from ignorance to economics. There's for every person yes, there is a reason, but no, I know firsthand that there is in some, entities, whether it be firms, law schools, there are some that are very institutionally resistant to the idea of mainstreaming this as a conversation. And I don't lose sleep over those folks because I try to concentrate my energy on people that understand the value of this. And hopefully, we'll get them all to turn over. But many times, people view this somewhat binary. And if somebody says, look, you know what? I think, for the most part, I think all of this is just crap. It's you either sink or swim, you do or you don't, you're cut out or you're not. It's very hard to change that type of person's mentality. The only time I've seen softening in those types of folks is when, unfortunately, either one of their colleagues or one of their family members or friends starts to struggle. And then all of a sudden it becomes personal. That's where I've seen people say, gee whiz, yeah, I'll be honest, Joe,
I thought this was all a bunch of malarkey, and I thought my own family.
It's nothing brings it home more than when somebody in your orbit is struggling. And not that I would ever wish it on anybody ever, but that's when, the paradigm switches on really quick, because all of a sudden it's like, gee whiz, maybe there is something to this. It's not just because they don't want to work. There's a lot of institutional frustration in that people tend to think that there's a lot of malingering and, frankly, just BS, that people use it as a crutch or an excuse. And the one thing that I'll tell you is there probably is some malingering and there probably is some BS. But what I will tell you is somebody that is actually struggling, genuinely struggling, you would not want to switch places with them. I can promise you that. They don't want to feel that way. And that's not just Joe saying it. That's, my limited but extensive experience talking to hundreds of people about this. Somebody that is in the depths of depression, let me tell you, they don't want to feel that way. Somebody that is struggling with chronic, pervasive anxiety, they don't want to feel that way. And for those of us listening, telling somebody to snap out of it or relax, just drop it from your vocabulary. It simply does not work. It inflames the situation.
And I think if you're a manager of other people or you're responsible for other people, it's the fundamental attribution error, that you look at an underperforming employee and you think it's that way because they want it to be that way. They want to underperform. They're lazy. They're malingering. To use your being a lawyer, 99.99% of the time, that's not it. There's something else. It may be you, the manager. It may not be. You may just be one of a million different things going on that is causing that person to struggle. But I can promise you, 99.99% of the time, they're not doing a bad job because they want to.
Absolutely. I'd even go on a limb here and tell you 100%. Nobody, if we think about it, nobody would affirmatively want to do a bad job for a million different reasons, right? But yet, there's this invisible boundary, which I understand, which is how far can I go to be supportive without being intrusive? How far can I go? I'm a layperson, and I am a layperson, and you're a layperson. How far can I go to be supportive without being intrusive? There's a lot of reasonable questions that arise when you talk about approaching somebody regarding mental health. And I understand that. And it requires some sensitivity, and it requires a willingness on the person that wants to help, understanding that nobody has any obligation to talk to you about their problems. They have the right to keep things private, and we only can do what we can do. The only time that it becomes a broader scale problem is if it is in fact affecting productivity in the office. For example, missing a deadline, not attending a hearing, where now you have an independent reason because the firm and the clients are at risk. So many times I tell people, I said, don't wait for that entry point. Don't wait for that entry point. Try to get ahead of it. And we teach people, how you can start the conversation. But a lot of people will say to you, and they're within their rights to say, I didn't ask for any help, or I'm fine, even though they're not fine. And, there's boundaries that you have to respect.
One of the managing partners we had on a few episodes ago said to us, one of the things I learned is that when people say I'm fine, that's when I need to dig deeper as a manager of the firm, because when they say I'm fine, they're not.
Well, you know this, Neil. 70% of communication is nonverbal, right? So again, when you're in front of somebody or even on Zoom, it's a lot different than if you're just on a phone call. One of the phrases that I look for or listen for is if you say, how's it going? How you been? They said, I'm hanging in there. That one for me, I'll hit the pause button, and depending on the circumstances, but that's one, but a lot of people, again, I understand it's not, you have to pick and choose who you share with. You have to pick and choose who you trust. You have to, most people that are struggling don't want to have everybody know what's going on in their life. I understand. You and I both, I'm sure we've been having, a bad day, a bad week, something may be going on in our lives. And somebody says, Neil, how you doing, buddy? And you're like, I'm doing great. I'm doing fine. Because it's just easier.
Yeah.
It's just easier. But at the same time, when somebody closer to your orbit that you do trust and cares about you, it's okay to say, I'm not doing okay. I'm not. But we all wear different masks. You've heard this, we've all got stressors. I tell people, I say we all have different roles in society. You and I right now are in our roles of, podcaster and podcastee, if there was such a phrase. But you're a lawyer, you're a father. I'm a lawyer, I'm a father, I'm a professor. You're a professor. We're friends, we're family. We have millions of roles, each with their own joys and burdens, right? So we all have stuff going on. But the common denominator is it can affect, our mental health and well-being. And that's, one of the things that we need to be vigilant about.
This has been amazingly valuable, and I really appreciate you doing it.
It's my joy. This is my joy.
How do you want to close this part of the conversation?
I think what I would really like listeners to take away from this is more than a couple of things, and I'll be brief. Number one is it's okay to talk about it. Number one, it's okay to talk about mental health. And the reason why, if you need justification, is your brain, the last time I checked, is an organ, and it gets the same dignity as your heart, liver, and lungs. And if I told you I had high blood pressure, you would demand that I get on high blood pressure medication. And if I told you I was having a heart attack, you would call 911 and make sure I had cardiac intervention. And I could go through all the other analogies, but at the end of the day, we have to give mental health the same dignity we give any other body part, period. Number two, resource information. And I shared a lot of resource information. Educate yourself. Educate yourself for your family, your friends, your colleagues. Education is power in this area. Go to NAMI, look around, learn a little bit about, maybe there's something you're most curious about, depression, anxiety, substance use. Educate yourself. And then third is, if you need help yourself and you've been on the fence, you've been struggling, you're embarrassed, you're ashamed, you think you're weak, you're not. And if you need the help, get it. The evidence is clear. It's not what Joe says, it's what the evidence says. Most people who get help can and do get better. And I'm going to say it again. Most people who get proper help can and do get better. So if you need it, please disregard the feelings. There is nothing to be ashamed about. You wouldn't be ashamed about high cholesterol or high blood pressure. And then finally, practice good self-care, which you hear all the time. We all talk about it, and we all probably get a B or a C, if that, with self-care. And what I mean by that is if you do not prioritize your own self-care, you are going to be much less effective for the people that need you: children, colleagues, clients, families, and friends. You are not only allowed, you are expected to set some non-negotiable boundaries so that you too can have a life which you deserve. And if you want to look at it from the perspective of being altruistic, that's fine, because you're helping others. But at the end of the day, you have the right to also enjoy and prosper in your own life. So set those boundaries and stick with them.
Great. Thank you very much. And I will make sure that we get the resources that you listed in the show notes. We'll make sure it's in the show notes when someone clicks on the podcast and when we do our promotion of it on LinkedIn and elsewhere. So thank you very much.